If we look at what kind of a state Ukraine is, it's a reasonably functioning pluralistic democracy. It has multiple political parties, it has reasonably free and fair elections, and there are changes of government and changes of president. However, it's a very young state, so the area that is much less developed is statehood. That means institutions, the division of powers. There isn't really an independent judiciary, which is an essential element of a functioning democracy and a functioning state. Behind the scenes, there are vested interests who still have enormous influence over the parliament and over mass media. The population itself is very disillusioned by its own government and its own political parties and leaders, has very little trust in them, and needs in many ways to be convinced that things really are changing. There are massive reforms going on in areas such as education, the pension system, the health service, and in mechanisms to deal with corruption. The place where things have really started to change and could have a very powerful influence on change overall and on public trust is something called decentralization. Decentralization consists of amalgamating groups of very tiny little local government administrative units. Up till now they've had very little power, virtually no funds to disperse, and have been very weak indeed. The amalgamation of these into larger units with real powers and actual tax-raising powers has begun to make a difference where they are working well. There are about 400 of these so far. All have been formed within the last 3 years. And where they're working well, people can actually see better roads, better services, health, education, and so on. And this could create a real sort of critical mass for public support for reform and energize the reform efforts further up the governance chain. In Parliament there are a lot of new people. About 50% of the Parliament elected at the end of 2014 were new people. They have maybe not yet got a proper grip on how things proceed. Lots of legislation is being pushed through. But legislation itself is not necessarily the answer. It's got to be implemented. It's got to be implemented in accordance with the rule of law, and that is not yet fully the case. One very important area that is currently in the news is electoral reform. It's a complicated system that Ukraine has for its elections, but there is strong pressure from reformists and from the international community to change to an open list proportional system, which would still be a PR system, proportional representation, but with local elements. So people who vote can still see a connection with the people they are voting for. This, if adopted in the way that the reformists hope, would reduce the influence of unfavourable elements or undesirable elements in the electoral process and would make for a much more balanced and fair electoral system. Then there's mass media. Mass media is an area where there is genuine pluralism and where there are still very strong influences from vested interests. These so-called vested interests are often known as oligarchs. Basically they're business tycoons with an influence in Parliament and over the mass media which is not conducive to ensuring that the public get a very balanced view of events. Last year a public broadcaster was set up for the first time. It is so far doing okay. It's viewed as reasonably objective. There is of course a very difficult challenge coming from the Russian mass media, which a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine watch on television because it's highly well funded. It's more sophisticated than some of the Ukrainian mass media. And Ukraine has, and the rest of the world in fact, has been subject to an onslaught of what I would prefer to call disinformation rather than propaganda. Propaganda can be positive or negative. This is actually disinformation I'm talking about. And it's very difficult to counter without being accused of inhibiting the freedom of the media. However, there are measures now in place to try to encourage more Ukrainian media, and there are a number of channels, particularly internet sites, which are devoted to challenging the Russian narrative and putting the facts straight. Finally, I should say what I think the West and the international community should be doing. It should be encouraging Ukraine, giving credit where it is due for what it amounts to a massive program of reform in very difficult circumstances, where part of the country is at war. But at the same time, maintain the pressure through conditionality of assistance.